Hi, it's again that time of the week where Glassnode brings out its weekly newsletter. So Glassnode is a company that's specializing on visualizing on-chain data. So it looks, for example, at Bitcoin, checks out what kind of people are buying, what kind of people are selling, what percentage of the market is currently in profits or in loss. So there's a weekly newsletter coming out, and I will put the link of this week's newsletter in the video description. So in this video, we're going to discuss what I find are the most important takeaways from that newsletter and what kind of developments we have seen in 2021, and thus what trends are likely in 2022. So you might have noticed that Bitcoin was pretty much on a sideways trading range for the entire year, right? It went up, it went down. We had these sell-offs very often after a new all-time high has been reached. And we've also had the negative performance during the summer month, which is pretty typical for Bitcoin. And so then another all-time high and again, profit taking. Now, a lot of people see this year as a pretty bad year for Bitcoin, right? It looks like nothing has really happened. But actually, if we measure this from beginning of the year, we are up 78%. So we have started at 29,000 and now we are around 50,000. And this is actually a very, very typical performance for Bitcoin, this 78%. This is very, very typical if we zoom out a little. Here, this chart is not from Glassnode, but I still think it makes a lot of sense to look at this in context. This is the Bitcoin logarithmic regression chart. So starting from where Bitcoin was just a few cents to all the way where it's now tens of thousands of dollars. So we see that Bitcoin tends to move within this channel, right? Most of the time we are within this channel, and it grew very quickly in the early days, and now the growth is somewhat flattening out, right? We are not growing that quick anymore in terms of percentages as we did in the early days. And if we zoom in over here, we can see that we started the year somewhere around here, one line below the middle of that logarithmic regression. And then we went above that, went below that, and again, now by the end of the year, we are pretty close to one line below this middle line. So we have basically grown pretty much at the same pace as this upwards trend over here. We have grown at the same rate that we would expect to grow. We have been somewhat cheaper than the average at the beginning of the year. And now again, we are somewhat cheaper than the average. So this kind of growth rate, this 78%, it's pretty much what we can expect for a typical year in Bitcoin. And of course, over the years, this will become less, right? The logarithmic regression, it is flattening out. So it won't be 78% the next year. It's probably going to be less. You can actually make that calculation and then you find these kinds of implied growth rate within that logarithmic regression. So in the early days, we looked at more than 1000% growth year over year. And then this flattens out. And now for 2021, the middle line grew by 82%. And then the next year it will be 78%, then 75, then 72. So that's the implied growth. And the volatility around that growth is actually in no way particularly high or low. So this was really a very typical year for Bitcoin. Now here's something interesting from the Glassnode newsletter. So what we see over here is the long-term Bitcoin price again, right? Since Bitcoin was just a few cents from the very beginning all the way to today on a logarithmic scale. And what we see here in purple and in orange is the circulating supply and the sovereign supply. So sovereign supply is the amount of Bitcoin that's not being held in exchanges. So that's the Bitcoin that's, for example, on your hardware wallet or in your MetaMask. And we can see that the overall circulating supply, it grows slower and slower over time, right? There's in fact this abrupt change in slope of that line, and this is simply the halvening, right? The new supply gets cut in half, so the slope of this line is decreasing. And when we look at the recent past over here, so this was the Corona crash. When we look at the recent past, the sovereign supply here, it tends to grow quicker than the overall supply. Or in other words, people are buying Bitcoin and putting it away in their hardware wallets. This is what this is indicating. Or here, another way to look at this is the short-term supply. It's somewhat constant over time, so people just use Bitcoin for trading. And the long-term supply over the many years, it tends to increase. So people simply dollar cost average in, they keep Bitcoin as a long-term investment. Now, what I find interesting about this, if you're interested in timing those cycles somewhat, is that the tops over here in the Bitcoin price, they also tend to coincide with the short-term supply being relatively high. So it means people are excited about the recent price movement and they buy into Bitcoin. And so the short-term supply is relatively high. And we've seen this repeatedly. We've also seen this in the 2018 run-up, right? The short-term supply, it increased. The long-term supply, it went down. So the long-term holders, they sold. The short-term holders went on board. Or you could also describe this as the time horizon of the average investor is going down, right? The time horizon shortens. People rather want to speculate than long-term hold. And if you look at this recently, this also somewhat worked. The short-term supply was comparatively high. And that's also when the price topped out. And now the short-term supply is comparatively low again, historically speaking. So this might indicate, right, no financial advice, but we have to interpret the data somewhat. This might indicate that we are not particularly high on the price now. We are not particularly heated. The market is now dominated by people that hold Bitcoin over the long term. It's not dominated by people that just short-term trade Bitcoin. Now here's another interesting chart. So this is a very similar look at the data, just split up in some way. So here in red, we've got the short-term supply. In blue, we've got the long-term supply. I'll show another chart on how Glassnode splits these two groups up. But first thing we see is that people tend to hold Bitcoin longer now, right? So there's less active speculation going on and more long-term investing. The blue line takes on more share. The short-term speculation shrinks down. Now there is dark red and light red, dark blue and light blue. And when the color is darker, it simply means that this specific cohort of investors, of speculants, they are in profit. So over here, we had a lot of short-term people in the market and they all were in profit. Over here, those same short-term people were in profit. Here, most short-term people were in loss. And right now we are pretty balanced. So the same amount of short-term speculators versus long-term investors, and they're both pretty much neither in profit nor in losses. But note, this is a chart over the entire year. And even though we have grown at a very typical rate for Bitcoin, the structure of investors has changed. It has changed to a more long-term view, which is potentially a good sign, right? You want to have as many long-term investors in the market as possible because they stabilize the price. If you've got a lot of short-term traders in the market, these kind of people might panic at some point when there is just a bit of a correction and then just accelerate that correction further, right? So you don't want too many short-term traders in the market. And so this is a very positive development for Bitcoin over the year. Now here's how Glassnode distinguishes long-term to short-term. I find this pretty interesting. They make the cutoff at around 150 days. I believe it's 155 days. So that's the result that Glassnode got from analyzing the data. Once you see wallets that haven't moved any Bitcoin after 155 days, then it's pretty unlikely to move again quickly in the future. And so that's where they make this cutoff. And so what might have happened is simply that people bought over here, and they didn't yet get enough profit out of their initial purchases, and so they simply just keep on holding. And that idea is in line with what we actually see with the balance on exchanges, because here in orange we see the balance on exchanges hasn't come down dramatically, right? From 2.6 million to 2.5 million. Not a lot of change here. And I don't think this information is too positive, because what it says is people still keep their Bitcoin on the exchange, right? They might have bought it over here and they haven't sold it yet, but they also didn't put it into hardware wallets. At least the majority hasn't done it. They still have it on the exchange, ready to be sold at any time. And so the way I interpret this is, in case we do see again another leg up here in Bitcoin, at some point there might be again profit taking. So if you're asking me, right, I can't read the future either, but if you ask me what's the most likely scenario, it is that when we do reach another all-time high, we're probably going to see another sell-off. But at the same time, Bitcoin is increasing by 70% per annum, right? So maybe it doesn't even make too much sense to try to time this in a lot of detail. Maybe if you're simply investing into Bitcoin, you can just profit from this long-term trend, because 70% per annum is an incredible growth rate, especially when you consider that this is the safest of all of the cryptocurrencies. Maybe you don't have to take on too much risk and you don't have to try to time this too much if you're simply buying and holding this over the very long term, and maybe you don't have to worry about these short-term bear markets. Maybe these are simply opportunities to continue to buy and to become one of those long-term holders rather than a short-term speculator that might end up buying the hype and then sell on the first retracement and potentially not make any money long-term. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to check out the premium membership as well, to be found at thebitcoinstrategy.com. There's a premium chat where you can ask me any questions. There's also exclusive content, videos, for example, on how I navigate the crypto market over the long term, videos on how to interpret various data points, so feel free to check that out. If you enjoyed the video, please also like the video. It will help the channel grow. The YouTube algorithm really likes likes. And of course, feel free to subscribe as well. I publish videos regularly. Last but not least, there's a public Telegram channel. We are more than 1,500 people over there. You can find us simply by searching for Bitcoin Strategy Channel within the Telegram app. See you next time. Bye-bye.